Kevin, hey man, so good to be in this class with you again. Be able to study New Testament together. I've got fond memories of NT 500, and so looking forward to, well, I hope we're some more good conversations this summer. We are going to start our in-person meeting for those of us who are in the neighborhood on Fridays at 3 p.m. this week. Week two, that'll join for that discussion will take the place of Forum 2 each week, and also excuse you from any need to comment on others' responses in Forum 1, just because, we can comment on one another's thoughts when we're together in person. So try to make it worth your while. Take some work off of your plate if you can make that Friday discussion, and then I think we're gonna maybe go out afterwards for a drink, those of us who are able. Anyway, it's week one, and I thought I'd send you a video reply, just to say hello, a little bit more personally than typing something into the forum. I'm not a I'm not a totally warm adopter of all of the asynchronous remote education. Leaves me feeling kind of dry. So this is one way I can try to enhance the connection a little bit, but also give me a chance to react a little bit to what you have written here in week one, which is great in both discussions. So keep this sort of thing up. I think what you're doing is exactly on target, probing, engaging critically the secondary stuff, thinking about where they disagree with each other, letting that kind of, you know, uh, prod your own mind a little bit. So good stuff. In the first forum on Habakkuk, you ask here at the end, what I'm thinking about uh, who is in view when Paul quotes Habakkuk saying, "The just by faith will live," or "the just one by faith will live." And here I think we can be left with a kind of false choice. So, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic with Witherington because I think that it's important to let Habakkuk's words have a kind of immediate meaning and value for the audience that he is addressing, that is sort of depicted for us. It's this generation of his people that are suffering just unspeakable cruelty. He's outraged at God, that God would allow this horror to befall God's people, use these wicked Chaldeans who are no worshipers of Israel's God to inflict all kinds of harm on Israel that is supposedly kind of a course correction for them. Like, what? And it's in that context that faith comes into the prophecy. And so we want, I think, following Witherington, to try to probe, well, what does it mean in that context? And along those lines, I would say, in chapter 2, where faith is introduced is in contrast to the ways of the people who are oppressing Israel. So they're described as proud, as arrogant, as puffed up. They're exploiting the vulnerable, taking advantage of the kind of bad situation in which the people of Judah find themselves. And it's in contrast to that the just will live by faith. So as opposed to living arrogantly, exploitatively, living by faith, which is to say, trusting God to provide rather than caving to a sort of dog eat dog way of living. I get what's mine, what I want for my people at whatever price that exacts upon others. That's the way of the proud, but the way of the just trusts God to provide, and so remains committed to loving God and to loving neighbor as God's law commands, even if that is costly and in circumstances that are just unthinkable. Um, Notice there too how the faith of God is involved in this. It's not just the faith of the just person or just people. What makes it possible for them to trust God is that God is trustworthy. And so the faith of God, that God will act in good faith, is what itself gives rise to the faith of the human. Um, it inspires the faith of the human. God's faith does. Um, so that dynamic, I think, is important to keep in mind, so that we're not choosing between the faith of God and the faith of the human, but seeing them as related to one another. And this is where, kind of coming full circle, I want to say Witherington forecloses on this text in a way that I just don't think is warranted, because what I think Paul implies is that this dynamic of the faith of God, the faith of the human, leading Israel through difficult circumstances across generations, has a messianic horizon. It indicates a kind of fullness of this dynamic of the faith of God and the faith of the human, and that fullness is the Messiah, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one person. And in Romans, Paul is teaching, or really responding to, how that life of the Messiah has spread to these non-Jewish people who have been baptized into the Messiah's life and are now learning the obedience of faith, learning how to be generous with one another in the way God has been generous with them, to welcome others in the way that God has welcomed them. It's that same dynamic of the faith of God producing as its fruit the faith of human beings, living, trusting God to provide, and that is what inspires their generosity and their welcome with one another, as well as patience and resolve as they're living under oppressive authorities, patience even with hostile people in the people of God, part of their community. These are all the ways that faith is going to work out in the rest of Romans. So I'm, as you can tell, sympathetic with what Witherington is trying to protect about the meaning of faith, the just living by faith in Habakkuk. But I think we should be open to a messianic horizon of these words that Paul identifies with the revelation of God in the Messiah. That's my take on that. I resonate with what you're saying here in the second forum. It actually fits with what we've just been studying in Habakkuk as well. Like, your social location and mine is pretty remote from what the people of Israel in Habakkuk's day were enduring, pretty remote from slaves in Paul's day, slaves in our more recent history and our society, our part of the world. And yet still we can kind of feel a little bit of the scandal of Paul employing this term to talk about himself. And I think that that scandal is designed to be subversive. You're going to see Paul play on this theme of slavery later on in the letter as well, famously in chapter 6, where he's going to make the paradoxical and somewhat outlandish claim that freedom itself is slavery to God. And I think part of the purpose there is to not allow the human institution or practice of slavery to claim what that means or to claim people's lives, but to insist that human beings cannot totally claim other human beings, that they remain open to God's purpose, God's power, God's life. And in that sense, there is effectively a redemption of slavery itself, insofar as being bound to God, beholden to God, is precisely what fully liberates a person, fully frees them to enjoy all that God has sort of destined for their lives. So anyway, this is going to also affect how Paul describes the life into which the audience of the letter, including us, have been welcomed. It's a life not of ruling over one another, but of giving ourselves to each other, not of, claiming that we are sort of representatives of God in a way that we can dominate other people, use God's law as supposedly what authorizes us to rule over others. Instead, it's a life of service to God, and recognizing that we are not the judges, but that God is the judge, and that God's judgment is manifest finally as mercy in God's Son, God's future, the Messiah. So that's going to spill out into what the Christian life is that Paul is calling upon the audience of the letter, and finally us too, to live in Jesus's name. So I hope that's helpful to you. I, like I said, resonate with what you're saying here in this second forum. And thanks for the good, thoughtful responses in both discussions this first week. If you want to reply to this video, you can. No pressure to do that, though. But if you don't reply, maybe at least give me a one-word received or something like that, so that I at least know the video came through and you were able to see it. Hope to see you on Friday, Kevin, and glad to be in another class with you. Thanks for your work in week 1.